Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4 of the VLL Podcast. I'm Dr. Christie,
I'm Dr. Kimmy.
and we're just a couple of doctors who enjoy discussing and taking a systems approach to learning and development problems and training.
And today we're talking about something I think leaders get wrong all the time. Why they think their training isn't working when the real problem is somewhere else entirely. Christy, I've been thinking about something you said about training orders versus strategy conversations. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because I think a lot of leaders don't realize the difference.
Yeah, so there's a huge difference actually, and it changes everything usually about what gets built and whether it actually works. So, for example, a training order is when someone, usually a leader or a manager, comes to L&D and says, "We have a gap. We got to build a course to fix it," in the most simplest terms. The decision's already been made, basically. The problem's already been diagnosed. L&D's job is one thing, and that is execution. So a strategy conversation is very different. It starts way earlier. It starts when the business goal is being set, when KPIs are actually being defined. So it starts back when people are asking, what does success actually look like and what has to be true? And this is the third most important part, how do people behave and work together, or how do they need to behave and work together for us to hit that goal? And those are completely different conversations.
So when you start working with an organization, which of those two are you actually seeing?
Almost always a training order. Someone says our reps aren't hitting pipeline targets, for example, build us a sales training. Or our customers are churning after the first 30 days, create better onboarding content. But when I get in and I start asking diagnostic questions, such as who actually defined what success looks like after onboarding, and did your learning and development team have any input? What does the data actually tell you about when customers leave and why? That's usually where we find the real problems. And it's usually not a training problem at all. Okay, so imagine a SaaS company. You've got customers signing up. They're excited about the product. They go through the onboarding. And then somewhere between day 30 and day 90, they churn or they fall off. They stop
Mhm.
using the product. They perhaps don't renew. They cancel their existing membership, all various forms of that. So leadership's first instinct is to assume the product onboarding isn't good enough. Our customers don't understand it. So let's make better onboarding training content. It needs to be more interactive. Maybe it needs to be shorter. Maybe it needs to be more comprehensive. Maybe it needs more gamification. It needs more things that they need to click on. We've got to use a better e-learning authoring tool. We need more animation, more graphics, whatever it takes. So they invest in building beautiful onboarding content. They've got more videos, more of those fun interactive modules. Maybe they add a couple of knowledge-based articles. Maybe they even add a comprehensive set of documents. They launch it, and unfortunately, the churn doesn't improve. But when I come in and I ask diagnostic questions, such as, for example, what does the data tell you about why customers are leaving? Are they leaving because they don't understand the product? Or are they leaving because the product isn't delivering the outcome they signed up for? Or maybe it's because there's no one checking in with them after day 7, or because they hit a wall trying to set things up and they didn't know who to ask for help. That's when the larger picture of what the actual problem is finally starts to come into focus. And usually it's not about the onboarding content at all. It's about the system around it. So there's no account management structure. There's no proactive outreach, no system for identifying when a customer is struggling and needs help. And what I often find one of the most important parts is that there's really no feedback loop to understand what's actually causing churn. And in short, people don't have answers to any of these questions that I'm asking them. Or when I say, what data do you have? They say, we're just not collecting that. And they don't have systems in place to collect it. In theory, the onboarding could be perfect. Customers could frankly understand your product quite brilliantly. But if the system doesn't have people and structures checking in, if there's no one helping customers through difficult early days, if there's no one identifying and fixing problems, customers are still going to leave.
To go for help.
Yeah, exactly. It could very much be that they understand the product, but the system to keep them engaged and to keep them learning and to keep them sustained and wanting to continue to level up with your product, learn new ways to use it, learn new contexts for using it. Those things don't exist. So that is effectively a business goal problem, not a training problem. And so let's say, for example, the business goal is you need to retain customers and you need to help them get to value quickly. That's your business goal. I don't know any business owner that doesn't want that. But what I find, and what's often the problem, is that nobody actually designed a system for that. Nobody asked, what does the entire system, so every single touch point on the customer journey, that's the full system, what does that need to look like so that customers actually stick around and expand? So they design an onboarding training. Here's how you turn it on. Here's how you take it out of the box. Here's how you put it on the wall, for example. I love a good IKEA example because if you didn't hear in the previous podcast, I went on probably a little bit too long about how I am not an IKEA customer because I cannot understand their instructions, and their instructions are an impediment to me using their product. So I don't even churn with them. I just don't purchase from them at all. But I digress. So they designed onboarding training, but they didn't design the governance, for example, the accountability, the touch points, the support structure that keeps customers from leaving when things get too hard. So again, this is all a systems design problem, and there's no amount of better onboarding content that will fix it.
And I reiterate, it's not the training. It's more often than not the fault of the training.
Yeah. So it's not that the training was bad. The training was probably fine. It was probably well designed, probably pretty clear, straightforward, but very strategically disconnected from how people actually engage with the product that they're selling. And frankly, it was built to solve the wrong problem. And it's because that problem was diagnosed without learning science and without systems thinking in the room. And so that's the difference between a training order and a strategy conversation. In a strategy conversation, learning and development is in the room saying, here's the business goal, retain customers and accelerate time to value. Great. Let's work backwards together. What behaviors have to happen to facilitate this goal? What systems have to be in place to sustain those behaviors once we hand off from onboarding? What does the customer journey look like? Then we design the learning and the support structures to make all of that become a reality. So in a training order, someone else decides the problem and the solution, and L&D just builds the course.
Yeah, they're essentially order
takers. Yes.
So you're saying one of these is actually much more beneficial than the other. One, because it works.
Yes. Turns out one actually works and one doesn't. For those who aren't familiar with data and statistics, even in the laws of science and nature and everything that is data, nothing is 100%. But there are things, and we do have data to support these things, that have a higher chance of working than others. And that's all that we can really hope for in the scientific world. So one of these things that I've just described has a very high chance of working. The other has a very high chance of failing. The science is clear. And frankly, I say this all the time, there is just no reason for us to keep guessing how people learn new things and how they retain new things and how they recall new things and how they apply new things in 2026. This is not a mystery, folks. We don't have to keep winging this. Just a little passionate about it, just a little.
And same thing if you want to start a new habit. You're not just going to start it and then do nothing to build onto it.
Right.
Your systems need touch points along the way.
Everything.
So let's get back to the topic at hand.
Okay.
So if training orders almost always fail, like we said, what's actually failing? What's actually breaking? Is it just that you're solving the wrong problem?
No. Yes and no. It's deeper than that.
Okay.
So it's about what's missing from the system itself. And so here's what I see. When a business goal gets set, let's say it's to improve customer retention or accelerate time to competency or hit a revenue target, the people who decide that goal are usually operations, sales leadership, C-suite. They own these very high-level business outcomes, and they should. They should be at the strategy table. That's their job. But the problem is that learning and development isn't at that same table, and that's where everything breaks down. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean about that. So you set a goal, you define a KPI, you expect people to change behavior to hit that KPI. But if L&D, the experts on behavior change, that is, if you've hired people in your L&D department who are experts on behavior change, which is not always the case, if the people who are actually experts in behavior change weren't part of that conversation, then they don't know what the system needs to look like to sustain that behavior change. Again, and sustainment is everything. So anyone can change their behavior for a few weeks. We can get back to the dieting and weight loss example, right? But if so for example, you change your behavior for a few weeks if someone's watching, or if there's an accountability measure being held over your head, you're gonna click the thing, you're gonna watch the training. If there's a training initiative happening, that's my brain, compliance.
Yes.
Yes. So compliance, right? So those are all things that we have to do, right? Because someone's watching or it's required. So here's the question. Does it stick? Does the practice continue? Does the mindset persist? That requires a system. It requires governance. It requires accountability. It requires people who own the practice. It also requires people who are experts in how to change behaviors and how to design a system that ensures that they persist over time. So if nobody designed that and the system doesn't exist, it's the equivalent of a Band-Aid that falls off when the humidity increases. Pretty proud of that one.
So you're saying we have a business goal set. Someone should be asking, what does the learning infrastructure look like for this to be sustainable? Or should it be one person or more than one person?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that the understanding of about how to actually change not just behavior, but cognitive practices and processes, understanding what makes behavior stick, what kind of support systems need to be designed in order to enable and allow all of those changes to happen, that's learning science. And most organizations, they have not built that into their strategy process. They set goals, they launch initiatives, and then they're shocked when people revert back to old patterns once the initiative.
That's a lot of sense, but what would an example of this look like?
So I just finished a discovery project with a client that sells training to other businesses. So they teach open book management. So this is how to run businesses more transparently, how to engage employees in financial literacy, how to create line of sight from frontline work to actual business results. So the methodology they have is solid. This company's been around for decades. Organizations that actually implement their methodology, they see real results. But the training platform itself that they use to distribute the training with had a problem. People would go through the training, understand the concepts, and then the implementation would fall apart. So leadership on my client side, their first instinct was to assume it was a content problem and effectively a platform problem. So maybe the platform wasn't engaging enough. Maybe people needed more resources. Maybe they needed better designed e-learnings. Maybe everything needed better features. So they brought me in to diagnose, what was really going on.
And what did you find?
Well, I'm so glad you asked, Dr. Kimmy. So we started with a comprehensive discovery. We surveyed almost 200 leaders and practitioners across organizations at different stages of their product implementation. We also did interviews with the president of the company, board members, as well as customer organizations that had been running their methodology internally for decades. And then we also did a couple of focus groups with people actively trying to implement their product at their organizations. And so the data told a really clear story. 42.5% hadn't even started implementing it yet. So effectively, that means there's a whole segment sort of stuck at the awareness level of learning. And they understand the core concepts intellectually, but they don't really know where to begin when it comes to wider implementation internally at their own companies. But the more interesting finding for the organizations who were actively implementing was this. Almost 30% cited the same barrier. They couldn't sustain the practices after the coaching engagement ended. And then 25% said that they just couldn't even find what they needed when they needed it in the learning system mode. So the core of this client's product is their weekly huddle methodology. That's the practice where everything converges. So all the core concepts that they teach, financial transparency, line of sight, accountability, employee engagement, they all converge in these weekly huddles. So if the leaders aren't running effective huddles, the whole model collapses. So in the discovery, 34% of respondents said they needed support with huddle facilitation. That's the highest priority capability gap by far. So here's what the data revealed. Its product. I also take a look at their existing systems. I analyze and diagnose. I look at their current LMS. I look at all of their content. I look at how it's being delivered. I look at their instructional design methodology. I look at all of that. And so I also collect data on that. And the data that I revealed was that there wasn't actually any training about these huddles. There was curriculum content. There were concepts. There were best practices for these huddles, but there wasn't actually a system designed to help people sustain the huddle practice itself. So a leader takes the training, they understand what makes a good huddle, they understand why it matters, they go back to their organization, they run their first huddle, and let's say it's awkward. The data's confusing, people aren't engaging, the conversation sort of stalls, and then the leader thinks, this isn't working. It's not that this client's methodology doesn't work. It's that nobody designed a system to help their customers through that failure. So there's no reinforcement structure. There's no train the trainer support, no option to go back and help customers implement the teaching at scale. So without that system, the practice dies, because something I talk about a lot with my clients and on other podcasts and with other colleagues is that just like the customer journey, and this is effectively a customer journey that we're describing because this is a business to customer company, but there's also a learning, like with IKEA. Here's a thing, here's a piece of paper that explains what thing is. Good luck, right? When you think about these customers, and so they need to learn about the huddle, they need to understand what the huddle is, they need to conceptually wrap their minds around what the huddle is. Then especially if you're a frontline manager and your role is to get your employees engaged in the huddle, you need what we refer to in the industry as train the trainer support, right? You need to understand how to teach others about this concept that you've only just learned about yourself. And then there's another stage in that journey, which is about sustaining what you've learned. So that iterative process you go through where you make mistakes and you get feedback on those mistakes. And currently, there wasn't any part of the system that was set up where they could go, and that requires a part of your learning journey where you can reach out to an expert, a more knowledgeable other, as we refer to it in the field of education, and you can get feedback on what you've done. You can test hypotheses, and that's an iterative process in the learning program that was missing here. And then there's also a final step that I like to call, it's a level up and sustain. So now you've gone from novice to intermediate. Now let's move you from intermediate to advanced. And so these are all part of a larger system, and none of that was actually present for these learners. And so without that system, the practice dies. The leader goes back to old patterns and the whole initiative effectively fails.
That really helps me wrap my head around what you mean by failure mode. Yeah.
Awesome. I love it.
Yeah. And it goes back to that. You understand what you need to do, but you don't know how to do it. Or teach others to do it or do it at scale. Yeah, exactly. So again, just to reiterate, it's such a big point. The training worked. People understood all of the concepts. It was solid training content. But it's that system that wasn't designed to sustain the behavior or the behavior change, we could even say.
Exactly. It's not because the platform that they developed was incompetent. And I'm going to bring the learning science into it because nobody did the backwards design work at the strategy level. So nobody asked, if we want leaders to run consistent, high quality huddles, what does the system need to look like to sustain that? So not just initiate it, but sustain it. So who owns it? What governance structure supports it? What happens when a huddle fails? What happens when people have questions? How do we bring people back into the system once they have mastered this concept? Because if they feel they have nothing left to learn from your training program, then they're going to not sign up again for it. So that conversation requires learning science thinking, and it requires understanding behavior change, sustainment, cognitive load, reinforcement, all concepts that we love to talk about.
Practice,
because we're nerds, but it requires someone in the room, frankly, who can connect the business goal to the learning system that makes it real.
Okay, so you're saying you need to do backwards design at the strategy level. Walk me through what that actually looks like. How do you operationalize it?
Yeah, so it's a process. I think that's the thing most people don't want to hear. Because again, we all want to wake up one day and look in the mirror and realize we've lost 20 pounds and we didn't have to do anything to achieve it. It starts with getting absolute clarity on the business goal, not the training goal, the business goal.
Okay.
So with the case study I mentioned earlier, the financial literacy company, their goal is sustainable financial engagement and transparency across organizations. That's what they sell. So with a sales organization, for example, it might be reps consistently engage prospects in strategic conversations instead of transactional pitches. If you're looking at a case study with a manufacturing plant, it might be 0 safety incidents and a culture where every employee is empowered to stop unsafe work. So you get really specific about that goal. It has to be something that actually drives business results, something the organization has committed to.
Okay, so we've got the goal, the business goal, then what?
So then you ask, what KPIs tell us that goal is actually happening. So for my recent client, that was huddle frequency, financial literacy scores, employee participation rates in financial decision making. For the sales organization that I mentioned earlier, that could be deal size, win rate, customer expansion revenue. For the manufacturing plant example, it could be incident rates, near miss reporting, speed of intervention when unsafe behavior is observed. So you're identifying the metrics that prove the goal is real, not aspirational.
What does this mean then for L&D?
I'm so glad you asked, Dr. Kimmy. That's my favorite question. So then you have to ask a very critical question, which is what behaviors have to happen consistently for those KPIs to move? This is where it gets interesting because a lot of what organizations think is a training problem shows up here as effectively a behavior problem. So a sales rep isn't asking strategic questions. Is that because they don't know how to? Or is it because they're under pressure to close fast? Or is it because their manager isn't modeling it? Or is it because the compensation structure rewards transactional deals over strategic relationships? Those require completely different interventions, and only one of them is solved by better training. So you map the behaviors, you get specific, you identify what actually has to change.
And for that case study we discussed earlier, what were those critical behaviors?
So for that company that teaches financial literacy, the main one was leaders run consistent high quality huddles. But underneath that, there are others, right? So this is where we get into sub-competent. We need to change. The main goal is leaders run consistent high quality huddles. So what needs to happen underneath that for that behavior to become visible on the surface? So they need to communicate financial data clearly. They need to facilitate conversations where employees actually understand what the numbers mean. They have to model accountability. They have to ask good questions. They have to follow through on what they hear in huddles. These are sub-competencies of a larger competency that all have to be achieved as part of the entire package of, and I'm using air quotes here, run consistent high quality huddles. So there are multiple knowledge and skills, i.e. behaviors that are required, and all of those need to be identified, taught, and measured. And these aren't one-time behaviors. They're practices. They have to happen weekly, over and over, even when it's hard, just like going to the gym. Can you tell I'm on a fitness journey?
Yeah, consistency.
Yes.
Okay, so you have the goal, the KPIs, the behaviors, then what?
So then you ask the question, what system has to exist to sustain these behaviors when external support ends? And in education, we refer to that as scaffolding. So when the compliance box no longer needs to be checked, when the eyes and ears are no longer paying attention. And this is because anyone can change behavior for a few weeks. When there's a training initiative happening or a coach is working with them, the question is, what keeps the behavior alive 6 months later, a year later, when the training initiative is done and everyone's moved on to the next thing? So for that client I mentioned earlier, for huddles, that system has to include things like a manager checking in regularly on huddle quality, tools and templates people return to, not just consume once, a peer community where leaders learn from each other, moments of recommitment and reinforcement when the practice gets hard, someone at the organization level who owns the practice and keeps it alive. And we have to support those people as well. Again, this concept of train the trainer, we need to make sure that managers are supported, that they have rubrics, that they understand what good looks like. And in my client's case, a high-functioning LMS designed to deliver all of these tools and systems and structures in a blended format and at scale, because that was one of their major business goals, which was to grow widely over the next 5 years. So that's governance. And that's a system.
What happens if you don't design a system?
So what we see over and over again, the behavior dies. People revert back to old habits, the initiative fails, and the organization looks back and says, that training didn't work. But the training worked. The system just wasn't there to sustain it.
So when we're doing backwards design, you're not just designing training, you're designing a system.
And that system includes training, but it also includes governance, accountability, reinforcement, community, tools, structures. Training is just one piece of it. Most organizations skip this step, unfortunately. They assume design the training means design the course. But real design means asking, what does the whole system need to look like? What's everyone's role in that system? What keeps this system breathing and alive long term? And that question requires L&D to be in the room from the beginning.
Okay, so you keep mentioning one of our favorite topics, which is learning science. But I want to understand how, or I guess what role learning science plays in this process. Because I think people assume learning science is just about course design. But it sounds like you're using learning science here a little differently.
Learning science is the methodology for understanding behavior change. And I do think it is important to note that there is learning science in course design. There's learning science in all of it. But course design is one part of the pie. And the entire process of changing behavior and aligning that behavior change to KPI, with those KPIs aligned to business outcome and slice of that. So learning science is the methodology for understanding behavior change, and it's effectively how you diagnose and design systems. And cognitive load theory, for example, since we're diving into learning science, it tells us if you're overloading people with information while they're trying to perform new behaviors, they can't sustain it. So you scaffold or you add additional support. You space things out, you design for the moment they need the information, not when it's convenient to deliver it. So for huddles, for example, that means don't give them all the financial information at once. Give them what they need to run this week's huddle. Then next week you build on that. You're spacing it out over time, matching the cognitive load to what they can actually handle while learning a new practice. The working memory is limited in space and time, very limited. So you can only learn so much at once, and you can only learn for a very specific amount of time. Multimedia learning research tells you people remember what they do, not what they're told. So you design for application and practice, not for information delivery, which is unfortunately where a lot of training programs fall short. They design for delivery, but not necessarily application and practice. So back to the huddle example, don't just watch a video about how to run a huddle, actually practice, run a huddle. It doesn't go well. Debrief, give them feedback, try again. There's a ton of research that shows that we actually learn more when we make mistakes than when we don't, effectively learning from doing. And then with backwards design is effectively a learning science principle. It's a methodology for design that is based on many learning science principles. And it says, start with the outcome, work backwards to understand what has to be true about the system. That's how you ensure everything is connected and builds towards the goal.
So these pieces of learning science are informing how to design the whole system.
Exactly. But it's critical to remember that you don't lead with learning science vocabulary in conversations with business leaders. You have to lead with business impact if you want them to trust you and to pay attention to what you're saying. So, for example, I wouldn't say to a CEO, we need to reduce cognitive load by spacing out the information delivery. Instead, I would say people are overwhelmed. We need to redesign the onboarding so that they are learning what they need to know when they need to know it. That way, sustainment is higher and time to competency is shorter. The business language is what moves the conversation. The learning science is the methodology underneath. It's how you diagnose and design, but it's not effectively a very good selling point.
Very true. Very true. So effectively, I guess you're doing two things here. You're using learning science as a lens through which to see the problem, but then you're going a step further. You're translating it into business outcomes for the clients.
Exactly. And from my experience, that's exactly where a lot of L&D professionals get stuck. They want to lead with the theory. So this is cognitive load theory. Here's why it matters. But that doesn't really land with the people that you've been tasked to help. What usually lands is, here is why people aren't sticking with this. Here's what research and behavior change tells us we need to do to fix it. Here's what that looks like in practice. The science informs the diagnosis and the design, but the conversation is about business results. Anyone who is in business will tell you that you need your business to grow. And in order to do that effectively, you need your problems to be solved.
So let's take the huddle example. With this example, where does learning science show up?
So it shows up in diagnosis or in discovery, which is another common term for this part. When we're looking at why sustainment is failing, for example, learning science explains it. People learn a concept in a training module, but then they go back to their day-to-day and they don't receive any reinforcement. There aren't any reminders, and there's no structure pulling them back to the practice. That's a scaffolding problem. That's a retrieval problem. That's a spacing problem. These are all fundamental learning science principles. But when we talk to client leadership, we can't say you have scaffolding and retrieval challenges.
No, not at all.
We say organizations need support structures that remind their employees and or their customers why this matters. And then we help them through the initial difficulty. Right now, the support system isn't designed. So you're providing the same insight, but in a different language.
But speaking of language, let's think of this in terms of business language. So the cost of getting it wrong. So thinking about that, what happens if an organization doesn't do backwards design work? What's the real cost?
It's a lot. Turns out it can get pretty expensive. And it's something that from what I've seen, most organizations aren't even really calculating. They're not actually paying attention to it in this way. There's not a line on the P&L to look at the loss of revenue or the loss of money as a result. So I'll break it down.
Okay.
So first, there's the direct costs. There's training design, platform development, coaching, time investment from leaders, employees, admins. If the behavior doesn't sustain, that's a very direct sunk cost. So you've just effectively spent the money and didn't get the outcome. So X did not produce the Y that you were hoping for. And that's often a pretty objective, pretty tangible thing to calculate. So with my financial literacy client example, if they kept going down the path of better platform, more content, fancier features, which is what they wanted initially, they would have kept investing in solutions that didn't address their real problems. And their real problem wasn't their content or their platform or their features, no matter how fancy. It's that the system to sustain huddles wasn't designed. And so then is opportunity cost. So the business goal that you're essentially trying to hit, the short answer is you don't hit it. For example, you needed to hit financial engagement, it doesn't improve. Customer retention doesn't increase. Revenue doesn't grow. You invested in training and you got nothing. And so then there's a secondary cost. And you and I talk about this a lot. And this is something that most people aren't measuring, and they should be, which is you lose credibility. So your customers or your employees, they see another training initiative, they complete it, nothing changes in how they work. They learn to tune it out. On organizations, they do this 3 or 4 times in a quarter or even a year. Whatever it is, people start to lose faith completely in learning and development. They just see a training come through on their desk or in their email, and they just think, here comes another training. Yay. The third cost is the other one I think a lot of people don't talk about, which is the most important one, because effectively business owners want to solve problems, because when you have roadblocks, great. Right? Learning and development at its core function is to solve problems of the business so that the business can function well from both an employee side and a customer. But what happens with poorly designed systems and poorly designed learning and development is that you're not actually solving the problems. You keep solving for the symptoms. And so you keep investing in content and features and platform improvements. For example, you buy shinier things, bigger things. You never address the system that's actually broken. So again, thinking to that financial literacy client, if they'd kept focusing on the platform, they would have kept missing the insight. And that insight was the systems to sustain their product wasn't designed. And that wasn't a platform problem. That was an architecture problem for them. They also had a governance problem. And effectively, the problem that they were hoping to solve was not going to be solved with the solutions that they initially proposed.
So the issue is you're treating a systems design problem as a training problem.
And it almost always fails. You can have the best training in the world, but if the system isn't designed to sustain it, it dies. So I'm going to give a pretty rough analogy here, but it's if you went to a doctor with a broken leg and they said, you need to do physical therapy, and then you did the physical therapy, but they never set the bone and they never put a cast on it. So the physical therapy isn't going to work because the system isn't right. And it would also arguably be very painful and make you likely not want to go to the doctor again. So that's what happens when organizations treat system design problems as training problems.
All right. If I'm listening to this and I'm a leader thinking about a training initiative, what should I be asking before we even start designing one thing?
Okay, so 3 things. These are the diagnostic questions that I always start with. So if you can answer yes to all 3, you have a chance. If you can't, you have to take a step back and figure out the strategy first. Number 1, is L&D in the room when you're setting the business goal and KPIs? Or do they come in after the decisions are already made? If they come in after, you have a training order, not a strategy conversation. And training orders almost always fail because the training isn't connected to how the goal was designed. 2, have we done backwards design? Do we actually understand what behaviors have to change? What system has to exist to sustain those behaviors? Or are we guessing at what training content we need? So if you're guessing, then you still haven't diagnosed the problem. You've diagnosed a symptom based on a hunch. And that's not how science works, kids. So you'll build training to solve the problem, and the real problem will still be there. Number 3, once people understand this, once they have changed their behavior, what's the system that keeps them doing it? Who owns it? How does it stay alive when the initiative ends? If you can't answer that question, then you don't have a sustainment plan. And without sustainment, we know, thanks to learning science, behavior reverts. And then effectively your initiative fails and so your ROI falls flat there.
All right. So you said I had to answer yes to those 3 questions. What if the answers to any of those questions aren't a definitive yes?
So then you start with a discovery, or as we talked about before, a diagnosis. You diagnose before you design, always. Get clarity on the business goal, the KPIs, and the behaviors, as well as the system that they will live in. You need to understand where the gaps are. Is it a skills gap? Is it a motivation gap? Is it a system design gap? Or is it all 3? Once you diagnose, then you can design for the problem-solving strategies. If you skip diagnosis and go straight to design, then you are basically solving problems that you don't understand the cause or the solutions for. And that's what most organizations do. They assume they know what the problem is. They skip diagnosis and they jump right into designing, and then it fails.
Well, diagnosis is the foundation.
Yes. Diagnosis is everything. If you diagnose wrong, the solution is wrong. No matter how well you execute on the wrong solution, you're not going to get the results that you need to solve the problem. But if you diagnose right, if you understand what's actually broken in the system, then you can design something that actually works. And then here's the kicker. You have to stay committed to sustaining it, but at least you're finally solving the right problem.
So if someone is listening to this and they're thinking about their next training initiative or maybe wondering why the last one didn't work, what would you say would be the one thing you want them to walk away with?
Good question. So I would say training failure is almost always a systems problem, not a content problem. If something isn't sticking, if behavior isn't changing, if KPIs aren't moving, the first question should never be, do we need better training content? But instead, it should be, was the system designed for this outcome from the beginning? Start there, diagnose before you design, because solving a system design problem with a training course is like trying to fix a broken leg without a cast. The effort won't work, the system isn't set up for it, and it's going to be painful.
Probably expensive.
Probably, yeah.
Dr. Christie Vanorsdale, thank you very much for another wonderful conversation.
Oh my goodness, Dr. Kimmy Rahak, thank you. This is why I love working and talking with you about these.
For you.